My name is Olivia, and I will be explaining the Wiggers diagram. This diagram, shown on the screen here, is an illustration of the cardiac cycle during the events that take place during a single heartbeat. Starting from the beginning of the cardiac cycle, we will first focus on this red-colored section of the diagram. I will highlight it right now. During this part of the heart cycle, the ventricles have already squeezed out or ejected all of the blood and they are relaxed. Simultaneously, the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, are wide open. At the end of the previous cardiac cycle, when the ventricles were contracting, the superior and inferior vena cava filled up the right atrium. Blood is constantly flowing into the right atrium. Blood is also being brought into the left atrium via the pulmonary veins, right here. When the atrioventricular valves open, the blood from the right atrium and left atrium passively flow into the right ventricle and left ventricle. This is because of gravity. At first, the filling of the atrium into the ventricles is rapid, but then diastasis occurs when the ventricles begin to fill up even more. Focusing more at this line here, this is the line representing the sound waves. During the first part of a heartbeat, when the atria are rapidly and constantly receiving blood from the superior and inferior vena cava, and the atrioventricular valves are open, it is possible to hear the sounds of the blood flowing through the atria and into the ventricles. This graph from our Pearson textbook does not have a sound or a heart sound wave depicting the sounds of the blood flowing during atrial filling and diastasis. And looking at the illustrative graph of the volume levels right above the images of the hearts at the bottom, this is just showing the volume levels of the left ventricle over time. And you can see that it starts to increase due to the blood from the atria filling the ventricles. I would say it is gradually increasing from about 100 milliliters to 110 in this beige highlighted section. And in the red highlighted section, I would say it increases from 110 milliliters to 135. I will explain more of why it increased there later on. In the middle section of the diagram here, it is just showing the pressure changes within the aorta, left ventricle, and left atrium. The pressure in the aorta is ever so slightly decreasing, just below, I would say, 90 millimeters of mercury. Even though the left ventricle is filling with blood, it is still very low at this time of the cardiac cycle, during atrial systole. Just to estimate the pressure on the graph, it is about 5 millimeters of mercury. And the pressure in the left atrium is also very low and is maintaining a steady 5 millimeters of mercury also. Here at the top of the diagram is the electrocardiogram, or ECG or EKG line. The first wave on the ECG, labeled P, is known as the P wave. I will write that down. The P wave refers to the depolarization of the atria. To put it more simply, the atria are contracting so that all the blood can eject and flow into the ventricles. As the atria go through systole and contract due to depolarization, the left ventricular volume increases from 110 milliliters and reaches the maximum 135, like I said earlier. The left atrium and left ventricle both experience a slight bump of pressure, as seen in the pressure diagram in the middle here. After atrial depolarization, the atria repolarize, known as atrial repolarization. This occurs during the QRS complex. And the reason why you can't see it in the EKG line here is because the QRS complex is too big and takes over the small repolarization phase of the atria. And during the time of atrial repolarization, the atria experience diastole due to repolarization, so they're relaxed. No contraction is happening. The time of the heart heart cycle now that I'm referring to that occurs after atrial repolarization is highlighted in purple right here, and I will highlight that now. This purple section is during isovolumetric contraction and ventricular systole, and that is also labeled on this Pearson graph or Wiggers diagram that they have in the book. So, referring to the ECG now, at the top, back to the QRS complex that I was speaking of earlier. To explain more about the QRS complex, it represents the depolarization of the ventricles now. Depolarization causes systole of the ventricles, so they contract. The image of the heart during this time, at the bottom here, shows that blood in the ventricles is trapped due to the AV valves closing rapidly. You can also see that the graph here in the Pearson textbook has a label of C, and that label there represents the AV valves closing too. Moving back, the picture is labeled isovolumetric contraction because right after the atrioventricular valves closed. So once the wave of depolarization reaches the ventricles contract and squeeze the blood, and this is again called ventricular systole. The semilunar valves shown here, or more specifically, the valves leading to the aortic arch and the pulmonary trunk right here, require a large amount of pressure difference between the valves and the aorta and pulmonary trunk. In the heart sound section here, the squiggly line labeled S1, or the first heart sound, represents the closing of the AV valves. It makes a really big lub sound. It is the first sound of the heart. So the heart makes a lub-dub sound, and a lot of people explain S1, or the closing of the atrioventricular valves, as the lub. And this is caused by the blood turbulence from the AV valves closing, like I said earlier. To repeat again, this is during the QRS complex, as shown in the ECG. So now referring to the volume of the ventricles graph. In the section measuring the ventricular volume, the point E is referencing the highest volume level that the left ventricle can hold at the end of diastole. This point is called the end diastolic volume, or EDV. Although the time when all four valves are closed and there is isovolumetric contraction, the heart cycle quickly moves to the phase called ventricular systole. This is when ventricles are pushing blood into the pulmonary artery and aorta. The right ventricle ejects blood into the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary semilunar valve right here, and the left ventricle ejects blood into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve right here. Blood flows from areas of high pressure to areas of lower pressure. Now moving on to the graph with showing the pressures of the aorta, the left ventricle, and the left atria. If we look at the pressure section, the pressure in the left ventricle rises rapidly to just above 120 millimeters of mercury. The ventricles have to build up enough pressure so the semilunar valves open and the blood in the ventricles can eject into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. The myocardium layer surrounding the left ventricle, you can see here that it's a lot thicker compared to the myocardium surrounding the right ventricle. And the reason for this is because the left ventricle uses a higher amount of force to be able to pump blood throughout the entire systemic circuit, or throughout the whole body, to the organs and other areas of the body. The black line showing the aortic pressure also increases from about 90 millimeters of mercury to slightly above 120 millimeters of mercury. It increases because the blood is flowing into the aorta. Left atrial pressure is maintaining a steady rate of around 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury. I'm just estimating that one based on what the diagram looks to be showing. So, moving on, the volume of the ventricles decreases since blood is ejected out. And if you look at the EKG section at the top, this area labeled the T wave on the EKG line depicts the repolarization of the ventricles. After this point of the cardiac cycle, we can focus on the sections of the diagram highlighted in the beige color, right here. Atrial systole occurs just after the Q in the QRS complex, like I said before, and ventricular diastole occurs just after the T wave, right here. So, looking at the illustrations of the hearts at the bottom of the diagram, the blood has left the ventricles and both the semilunar valves and AV valves are closed. You'll notice in the ventricular volume graph right here that the ventricles still have some blood in them. The point labeled F is called the end systolic volume, and I will write that down right here. This is how much blood is left in the ventricles at the end of systole and right before diastole starts. The end diastolic volume and end systolic volume can be used to determine stroke volume. It is the volume of blood ejected during each heartbeat. When the ventricles relax during ventricular diastole, the semilunar valves shut, resulting in the second heart sound. So this is labeled S2 for sound 2, I'm guessing, on the heart sounds line. And this is the dub sound of the heartbeat. So now, referring back to the pressure line on the diagram, when the use of the graph showing pressure changes on the Wiggers diagram, we can see that right when the ventricular diastole begins, the aortic pressure drops slightly and then increases again. This right here is called the dichrotic notch, and it occurs right after the aortic valves close. And I will write that down right next to where it says, the dichrotic notch. So labeled B, that's where the aortic valves close. And just to repeat, the aortic valves open in the area or in the part that is labeled A. And again, the AV valves are closed during right here where it's labeled C. So going back, so this notch is due to the rebound of the blood off of the aortic valve when they close. Now looking at the red line depicting the pressure changes of the left ventricle, we can see that pressure has dropped from about 110 115 millimeters of mercury to almost no millimeters of mercury. I'm guessing about 3 to 5 millimeters at this point of mercury. As the cardiac cycle begins to repeat itself for another heartbeat, the atria fill with the blood that is constantly being pumped into the heart from the veins and the vena cava. Thank you for listening.